I got both the swords. Guess I wield the power of Grayskull now. They actually had these at Spirit Halloween. I got this one last year during their closing sale. You've probably seen it in the back of my videos. And I figured, what the heck, I bought the She-Ra one this year during their closing sale because, well, considering what I do around here, I could very easily use these as props. But anyway, let's talk a bit about She-Ra. So, She-Ra, arguably the most popular girls' show to come out of the 80s, and it was also very popular with boys as well because She-Ra was presented as an equal to He-Man, and we thought that was pretty cool. And in the 80s, when almost all girls' cartoons and toys consisted of pink, squishy, saccharistic things, She-Ra gave the girls something that they desperately needed. A hero that can keep up with the boys. And it always did bug me that She-Ra never really saw much of a revival because pretty much everything from the 80s has been tapped and rebooted and reimagined and brought back in some form, either through a show, a movie, or a comic, with varying levels of results. Though granted, there are still a few popular 80s properties that have yet to get any type of revival. Still waiting on you to bring back Inhumanoids, Hasbro. So when it was announced that Dreamworks was going to be reviving She-Ra, people were excited. I was excited. I mean, they did a great job with Voltron, so obviously they can do She-Ra really well, right? But then controversy struck because they released a bunch of images from the show, and some people liked what they saw, some people didn't. Me personally, I didn't have too many things to say about them. I thought it looked fine. Although, I think that some of the images were a bit misleading, like the one with Glimmer, it made it seem like she was going to be some kind of giant, but turns out I think she's one of the shortest characters in the show. So I think they could have picked some better images to use, but hey, that really doesn't matter as long as the show is good, right? So in the original show, the characters were vaguely adult, I think. Now that I think about it, I actually don't know how old some of the Masters of the Universe characters are supposed to be. I'm guessing a lot of them are in late teens, maybe in their 20s, you know, old enough to handle their responsibility. In the new She-Ra show, everybody is a young teenager, so you know what that means. Emotional teenage angst, along with stuff like makeovers, sleepovers, and a prom episode. You know, of all the things I would think they would put in a She-Ra reboot, a prom is not one of them. Now, there were a few things that I did like initially. I liked the redesigns of Hordak and Shadow Weaver. It seems like they have a much more threatening presence now, because let's be honest, original Shadow Weaver was not that interesting, and Hordak was, let me put it to you this way. Every time he turned into a rocket, I always laughed. And they also went into Shadow Weaver's backstory a little bit, very briefly, however. And they did kind of address the fact that Hordak is like a cyborg, because his first scene was like him standing in the shadows with like robot arms prodding him and stuff and making repairs, I suppose. And I thought that was really neat. Though I'm not really digging the little coif of hair they gave him. I don't know why they couldn't just give him the spines he originally had. I like the design of the Fright Zone as well, and in fact all the environments looked really good, and a lot of the designs did seem to resonate with a lot of the Filmation designs. I did like a lot of the world building stuff as well. They did establish that there's a lot of ancient technology scattered all over the planet, and both the Rebellion and the Horde are trying to get to it, but neither side seems to really understand what it all is. And I even liked a lot of the new character personalities, but I'll talk more about that in a little bit. I would say Adora's story arc was the best part of the whole show, because they kept a lot of aspects from the original, how she never knew her parents, and all she knew was how to fight for the Horde, but she never really knew that the Horde was evil, because from their perspective, they're doing the right thing, until she goes out and sees all the atrocities that they've committed. And that was probably the best part of the original She-Ra show as well, because when you compare it to He-Man, He-Man was, you know, Prince Adam. He was a prince, he was son of royalty, and He was the bad guys were basically just a bunch of freakish monsters that lived in a cave, you know, so the good guys always had the upper hand. But in She-Ra, the bad guys had basically won. They were slowly taking over the planet, and that's when Adora saw that what the Horde was doing was bad, and that's why she joined the rebellion. And so it made the characters a little bit more relatable, and it made you want to cheer for them a little bit more, because when the good guys are the underdog, it makes for a much more compelling story. Or as compelling of a story as Filmation could do. And I actually did like the whole thing with Catra as well, because her and Adora were best friends, they trained together, they fought together, and when Adora left, she felt betrayed, but at the same time, it also seemed like Catra was not too happy with the Horde either, although not necessarily because they were evil, but more like she was sick of taking orders from them. And it did seem like there was going to be a point where she would defect and join the rebellion as well, but then she just went full heel turn, and it was a genuinely upsetting moment. But at the same time, as well handled as this was, there were a lot of other things I feel like they could have did a lot better. Like, for example, they could have expanded upon the Horde a little bit. Back in the 80s, you know, bad guys, they were just bad guys, you know. They were there to be an opponent for the good guy. But in this version, what exactly does the Horde do? I mean, yeah, they take over and they terrorize villages and all that, but why? What's the point of all this? And what is up with the Horde soldiers? In the original, they were genuinely threatening giant robot guys, and now they're just like mostly a bunch of kids, and a lot of them are just cadets, like Adora and Catra were. And that one kid is useless. Why the hell does the Horde keep him around? And yes, it is fair to compare this show to the original, because when you have a reboot of something, obviously you're going to have something to compare it to. And when one show does something better than the other, it's just going to make the faults seem that much more obvious. Now, one thing I have been hearing a lot of is that people who don't like the criticisms of the show are saying stuff like, oh, well, critics obviously haven't seen the original or haven't seen it in decades, so they clearly don't know what they're talking about. Who the hell do you think you're talking to? And yes, of course, there were obviously going to be changes with the show, as is the case with all reboots. But just because something is different doesn't mean it's free from criticism or was done poorly. So let's start, shall we? In the original show, Glimmer, while often headstrong and made a lot of mistakes because, well, she was a young leader and she was still learning, was very fierce and would never let her emotions get in the way of a fight. New Glimmer has mommy issues and won't shut up about them. I think Bo was one of the more tolerable characters in the show. He did seem every bit as skilled as original Bo, so that was really good. Although they really could have toned down on his cringy dialogue. There were a lot of times where he really didn't need to say anything, because he would say stuff like, "We're the Friendship Squad!" And I'm just sitting there like, no, don't say that ever again. They turned Madame Raz into a crazy old lady that lives in the woods, and it seemed like they were trying to do maybe like a Yoda thing with her, where she, you know, acted all absent-minded and all that and goofy, but she probably knew more than she was leading everyone on to believe. But then she just kind of went back to being crazy, and then we didn't really see much of her after that. They turned Cal into a plushie. Why would they do that? He was a prominent character in the original show, and they just made a very brief reference to Lookie, and you know what? I'm okay with that. I think the one that irritated me the most was probably Seahawk, because they turned him into a egotistical, boastful show-off. In fact, I think on Twitter I mentioned that it was like somebody was doing a really bad impression of Aquaman from Batman the Brave and the Bold. And I still stand by that. In the original show, Seahawk was a badass pirate who didn't take any sides and just did whatever the person that paid him told him to do. And Adora made him realize that doing jobs for the Horde was wrong because they do bad things. Isn't that much more interesting than turning him into a 4th or 5th comic relief character? You'll never be as cool as Aquaman. But like I said before, there were a few character personalities that I did really like. I liked Mermista, although I think it might be because her attitude kind of reflected mine throughout most of my viewing. I thought Scorpia was kind of tolerable, although I didn't really like how dumb they made her. I mean, the original Scorpia wasn't exactly a genius either, but she would never, like, draw pictures and say stuff like Kitty whenever she sees Catra. Although I think I could probably get used to that character if I were to watch more of this. I do like the new Swiftwind, I gotta admit. His personality is a lot of fun, and he's always talking about stuff like standing up for the rights of horses and stuff like that. Admittedly, I do miss the original voice. It was Lou Scheimer, the head of Filmation, that actually voiced the original Swiftwind. And he would do it in this really gravelly voice. And every time you would hear that voice coming out of a majestic flying horse, it was just always funny. Of all the characters, I think Entrapta was probably my favorite because she was like a crazy, eccentric scientist type, and I always found characters like that to be pretty fun. Although, I do have to admit, her voice, she kind of sounded like that nerdy kid Data from The Simpsons. And as soon as I realized why her voice sounded familiar, and I connected it to that character, I can no longer unhear it. But she's pretty cool, she's eccentric, and originally she was part of the Horde, and she joins the Horde in this one as well, but I can't in good faith call her evil or anything like that. She just does her own thing. She's in her own world. She's not even a part of this show. She's just doing her, you know? And she's got some cool powers. She's always tinkering with robots, and her hair grabs onto things. I'm sorry, I sometimes forget how on the nose a lot of the names are. Entrapta, she grabs things with her hair, and then there's a character called Netassa, and she tosses nets. Oh boy. I mean, this is Masters of the Universe. Everybody has a stupid name, but sometimes you forget. Although, I'm not sure if this is part of Masters of the Universe anymore. See, here's the thing. They changed the lore of She-Ra a lot in this show, to the point where I don't know if Masters of the Universe is compatible with this anymore. And a lot of the stuff they changed seemed like some really big missteps. For example, everyone knows Adora is She-Ra. Everybody. The Rebellion and the Horde. Everyone knows who she is. In the original, her identity was only known to a few people, just like with He-Man. But, admittedly, the secret identity aspect of it was not exactly the strongest part of the show, and I know there was a reason for it. Like, I think they were doing that just so they protect, you know, the secrets of the power of Grayskull and all that. But at this point, I do have to ask, what's the point of her having a dual persona if everyone's just going to know who she is? And in this version, the sword is some kind of technology. They only briefly go into this, but then they establish that apparently the whole planet is some kind of machine, and when the Horde gets a hold of it, they can cause all kinds of destruction. But then when the other princesses of powers, and yes, all the other characters are princesses in some form, when they bring their powers together, they can stop the Horde from doing that or something. And that was kind of the whole point of the whole show. They were trying to reunite all the princesses so they can, you know, restore balance. So a lot of people were comparing this show to Steven Universe and saying that they drew a lot from that. But honestly, at this point, it's feeling more like My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic. They also established some kind of lineage to She-Ra. Like, there have been many other She-Ras before Adora, and they even showed one or two of them. And that kind of calls back to Masters of the Universe too, because there were many holders of the Sword of Power. But I do have to ask, you know, is a Masters of the Universe show going to even work with this at this point? I do know that they are working on a He-Man movie. I really wish they wouldn't, because I think I would prefer a TV show instead of another movie. But because of that, they were kind of limited in how many references they can use to the original Masters of the Universe. They do mention Eternia very briefly, but at some point, they're going to have to go into this, right? I mean, when Adora transforms into She-Ra, she still says, "For the honor of Grayskull." They're going to have to tell them what Grayskull is, right? And to me, that is probably the most disappointing aspect about this, because it does feel very wrong to have one without the other. It felt that way with the 2002 Masters of the Universe reboot as well. And it sucked because they were planning to introduce She-Ra. They had the Horde in one episode. They had a bunch of other characters that were associated with She-Ra. Had they gone to a season 3, they probably would have done it, and it would have been awesome, but it never came to pass, and honestly, it was kind of a bummer. You see, here's the thing about He-Man and She-Ra. Back in the 80s, they did something that not a lot of things did. They bridged a demographical gap. The shows were enjoyable by both boys and girls. I had a cousin who used to watch He-Man with me, and she loved She-Ra, and I used to like watching She-Ra with her. The toys were compatible with each other. You can buy some from both lines, and they'd still work together. And She-Ra was treated as an equal to He-Man. And it was great. And I think the worst part about this is that we're probably not going to get that again. Especially considering how much fighting there's been about this show. See, I consider myself to be a fair critic. I always try to weigh out the good and the bad, and I always try to tell it like it is. And nothing irritates me more than seeing two opposing sides go at each other. So to people who didn't like this show, you are free to dislike it for whatever reason you want, but leave people who do like it alone. And to people who do like She-Ra, not everyone who criticizes the show is a sexist, chauvinistic pig. And to both of you, you gotta learn that people are going to have different opinions. Learn to live with it. Ugh, for God's sake. This is Ghostbusters all over again. I don't know why I even bother with social media anymore. It's just devolved into noise. You know that sound that old dial-up modems used to make? You know that noise? Yeah, I'm convinced that that wasn't the sounds of the modem. I think that's just what the internet sounds like. So as for the She-Ra show, to summarize, there were a lot of things I think it did well, but there were also a lot of things I still think the original did a lot better. And, well, it's certainly not the worst thing I've seen. Hell, it's not even the worst thing I've seen this year. I mean, I've had to review Reboot the Guardian Code and that horrible Rocky and Bullwinkle reboot and whatever the hell that Mega Man show is supposed to be. I mean, next to those, She-Ra looks pretty good, doesn't it? By comparison. But on the other hand, I do feel like there are a lot of better shows on Netflix right now. You know, Castlevania, the animated series, was great. Hilda is really good. Dragon Prince, for all its faults in the animation, is still a very good show. And, of course, we're going to have the final season of Voltron really soon, and that whole show was really good. So I guess by that logic, I just found the show to be okay. It's just kind of middle of the road. But, hey, what did you think of She-Ra? Leave a comment below and let me know. But, for the love of God, don't fight about it. My name is Rob, and I'm gonna go take a nap. I'm tired.